This wasn't the story that was supposed to be written. When Barack Obama secured a book contract back in the early 1990s, he was still in law school and recently named the very first black president of the Harvard Law Review. When this selection made the national news, a few publishers became interested in the young man who was having such an impact. So he agreed to take a year off after graduation to write a book about the state of race relations in America. The book that was published, however, was quite different. What began as an analysis of race relations became a reflective journey through Obama's own experiences growing up. Born at a time when his parents' marriage could have been considered a crime in several states, young Barry Obama grew up a careful observer of life on two sides of the Pacific and on all sides of the racial divide during decades of profound historic struggles and change. This summary dives into Obama's journey to find his own place in the world by understanding the father for whom he was named. It explores how this journey unlocked the host of family secrets and intergenerational struggles that brought Obama into the world, and why the perspective he gained along the way became a guiding force on the path to becoming U.S. president. Hawaii in 1961 was the stuff of holiday dreams and Kodachrome postcards for mainland Americans. When one family welcomed a son into the world there in August, his very existence was the manifestation of several American dreams. One dream had lured a young man all the way from Kenya in 1959 to the University of Hawaii, where he became the first black student. Another had drawn the family of Ann Dunham all the way from Kansas to Honolulu. When Ann met that young foreign student, Barack Obama, he was an already married international scholarship recipient studying econometrics, and she was a local student. They attended the same Russian class, and soon Ann was bringing him home for family dinner in the guise of offering hospitality to a foreign student far from home. Before long, Ann and Barack were a couple. They married in February of 1961, just 6 months before Barack Obama Jr. was born. Less than 2 years later, Barack Sr. would leave to attend graduate school at Harvard University. After the couple divorced in 1964, he returned to Kenya. Meanwhile, Ann returned home to her parents in Hawaii with her young son. But by 1965, Ann had met another foreign exchange student, Lolo Soetoro from Indonesia, who was doing graduate work in geography at the university. The couple married that year, and by 1967, Ann and Barack Jr. moved to Indonesia to start a new chapter. For 6 years, Barack, now registered at school under the anglicized name Barry, ran with Jakarta's children through the chaotic streets and studied Indonesian. From beggars and bullies to the life-or-death struggles of his own stepfather, Lolo, he learned about the realities awaiting him. A quiet and stoic man, Lolo taught young Barry that life would be tough and that he needed to be ready for it. These words would become prophetic sooner than a young boy of 8 or 9 could ever imagine. During these years, Ann took care to ensure young Barry learned English. She understood how important the language was for his future education. But waking up at 4 a.m. to study via a correspondence course was Barry's least favorite part of his childhood. There were many more challenges in raising a young son in Indonesia, however, including access to adequate health care and infrastructure. So it was only a matter of time before Ann announced that Barry's life was about to change again. When he was just 10 years old, Barry returned to Hawaii to live with Ann's parents, initially without the rest of the family. While relieved that he would no longer be rising before dawn to study, the move meant stepping into the unfamiliar once again, this time utterly alone. Moving in with his grandparents made Barry realize how much of his early life had been shaped by the many children that surrounded him in Indonesia. Life with Ann's parents, Madeline and Stanley Dunham, was marked by a quiet, solid, Midwest calm that was a stark contrast to the chaos of Jakarta. By the time Barry came to live with Madeline and Stanley, they had already adjusted to Ann's choices: to marry an African man, divorce him, marry Lolo, and find a new life in Indonesia. They were family, plain and simple, and while racism was apparent to them, they did their best to ignore it. Barry felt safe, wrapped in their middle-class cocoon. During the fall term of 1971, Barry was welcomed into Punahou Academy, the prestigious prep school for Hawaii's elite. It was at Punahou that a teacher first called Barry Barack, asking which name he preferred. He chose to stick with Barry. Yet this innocent inquiry about his name led to questions about Barry's Kenyan father. Without memories of his own to go by, it was at Punahou that Barry first started making up tales about his origins. He would enthrall fellow students with stories of his father, now a Kenyan prince, and his grandfather, an imaginary tribal chief. One of only 2 black students at the academy, the curiosity of his fellow students helped him feel a little special. So when Barack Sr. wrote out of the blue to say he was visiting Hawaii for Christmas that year, his son imagined that his lies would be exposed. Even more, his father would arrive just 2 weeks after Anne was scheduled to return to Honolulu with Barry's baby stepsister, so that she could pursue graduate school at the university. From an isolated child living alone with grandparents to a full house complete with long-lost father, Barry's world was about to rock once again. The father of young Barry's imagination was not the man who arrived that December in 1971. The trip to America was part of Barack Sr.'s recuperation from a serious car accident which had left him with a pronounced limp. But with his long limbs comfortably in an armchair and his thin legs crossed, he spoke intelligently and eloquently about politics, culture, and history. Barack Sr. could elevate everyone around him, including young Barry. As for a father-son relationship, the month-long visit was too short to forge anything but a fleeting impression. There was a certain shyness on both sides, the chasm between them considerable after a decade. Barack was impressed with Barry's studies, but openly disdainful of other things, and authoritarian in his approach. With Christmas on the horizon, one evening Barry settled in to watch The Grinch Who Stole Christmas. Barack Sr. openly objected to his son watching too much television and not studying, even at Christmas. Young Barry felt humiliated and harassed, and fled to his room. There, he overheard his grandfather yelling at Barack Sr. to stop being so hard on the boy, while Barack argued that young Barry was being spoiled and needed a stronger hand. Anne defended Barack against her own parents and son. In that moment, a host of hidden family dynamics and long-buried tensions burst open. Barry felt his family was never the same again. Even worse, he learned the next day that Barack Sr. would be coming to his school and speaking to his classmates. He collapsed inwardly at the thought of his own carefully crafted origin stories being exposed as lies, and the humiliation and ridicule awaiting him. What happened instead was that Barack Sr. was a gracious and intelligent guest. He shared stories about Kenya, evoking the unique wildlife and natural beauty of the land. He described the people's struggle for freedom against unjust colonial rule and the rich history of his own people, the Luo tribe. Barry's classmates were enthralled and his teachers impressed. Thankfully, Barry had avoided public humiliation. Before Barry's conflicting feelings about his father could settle, it was time for Barack Sr. to return to Kenya. While packing his things, he found one last gift he'd forgotten to give Barry: 2 records of African music. Listening to the records with his eyes closed, Barack Sr.'s tall, thin frame began to sway like a young man, even with his injured leg. Arms raised, he moved as if these dances were ancient, imprinted deep in muscle and bone. He called for his son to join him. And so young Barry attempted his first steps in time with the thumping drums, dancing with his father. A few years after Barack Sr.'s visit, Barry's mother and baby stepsister returned to Indonesia so Anne could begin her fieldwork there. Young Barry chose to remain with his grandparents in Hawaii and continued to excel at Punahou. In Hawaii, he had the chance to be immersed in a truly multicultural environment, one built on mutual respect and appreciation. His academic performance earned him a full scholarship to Occidental College. And so, in 1979, he moved to Los Angeles to begin his next journey. In Los Angeles, the mutual respect that Barry had come to expect in Hawaii was completely absent. His professors and classmates at the prestigious liberal arts institution seemed not to notice the economic disparities and open racism that was everywhere. When he spent time with other black students or out in the community, he encountered open contempt for all white people, and a fatalism about being locked in an unjust system. In 1981, he participated in the campus divestment protests over South African apartheid. But eventually, the tension between his liberal arts institution and life in Los Angeles became too much. Disillusioned, he learned of an exchange program that would allow him to finish his studies at Columbia University. While he held little hope that a Columbia education would be more in alignment with his own perspective, at least he'd be in New York City. It was there that the questions which had been brewing for almost 2 decades came bubbling to the surface. It was in New York that he felt the pull toward a deeper relationship with his father in Nairobi, and there he started to yearn for a sense of belonging, a sense of home. Being both white and black, or neither fully one nor the other, became increasingly complicated as young Barry grew into a man. He became more aware of the history of racial struggle and oppression, and chose to reclaim his name, now introducing himself as Barack. It was also during his college years that he received an unexpected phone call from abroad. Over the crackling phone line, a woman introduced herself as Aunt Jane in Nairobi. She was calling to inform him that Barack Sr. had passed away in a car accident. After delivering the news, she quickly hung up, leaving young Barack to process the loss of a man he hadn't seen since 1971, and from whom just a few sparse letters survived. And who was Aunt Jane? The sudden convergence of his life in the U.S. and an unknown family in Kenya left a lasting impression, one that would draw young Barack to the continent just a few years later. Graduating from Columbia in 1983 with a double major in political science and English literature, Barack watched as his college friends took up prestigious careers in sectors like finance, while he announced a career path was in community organizing. The problem was, this wasn't really a job category, and no one quite understood his choice. Barack's college friends thought of community organizing or politics as a no-win career, too much effort for too little payoff. Meanwhile, his black friends and colleagues cautioned him about choosing a career that could very easily keep him impoverished. Without money, it was much harder to create impact, let alone lasting change. But when he was hired in 1985 to head up an interfaith community project in Chicago, he settled into his work with energy and hope. It was in Chicago that he first understood how deeply intertwined America's problems with race and class truly were. As he organized tutoring programs in Chicago schools, he saw how quickly children lost hope in the under-resourced and crumbling ones. While planning tenants' rights initiatives, he saw how many young men seemed to have nothing to do in the middle of the day, already convinced there was no future for them. Meanwhile, his position in an interfaith organizing effort drew him into the orbit of pastors and leaders who dealt in hope on a daily basis. He attended churches where voices blending in glorious harmony were accompanied by swaying bodies, raised arms, and beaming faces, singing words like, "I'm so glad that Jesus lifted me." Yet, every conversation with a pastor, priest, or fellow organizer raised similar questions. Why are you in this fight, Barack? What are you doing here? Barack was a bit of an anomaly. He was successful as an organizer, but hadn't grown up in Chicago. He had no personal connection to the cause. Every time these questions were asked, they highlighted some long unanswered mysteries about Barack's own origins. Which is why, after just 3 years, he announced his departure from Chicago to attend Harvard Law School. It was the career move many expected from the bright young political mind. Less expected was the one caveat that before law school, he would go to Kenya and seek out the family he had long known about, but hadn't yet met. It was time to go home, in a sense, to a place he had never been. When Barack arrived at Kenyatta International Airport, without his luggage, it was with anticipation, but few expectations. His lost luggage required a visit to the office, and the clerk there had known his father during his time in Nairobi. Within minutes of arriving in Kenya, Barack experienced the first occasion that his last name brought a sense of comfort and connection, instead of highlighting his foreignness. The feeling of connection only increased as he passed through customs and was greeted by an enthusiastic aunt waving from the arrivals terminal. His half-sister, Oma, was there too. Barack had connected with her a few years earlier over the phone in New York after the tragic death of their other half-brother in a road accident. Conversations with her had been a powerful draw for him to meet the rest of his family, and she remained beside him through the trip as interpreter, guide, and companion. It was through Oma that he heard the story of his other grandfather, Hussein Onyango Obama, who was a successful farmer and elder of the Luo people, about his many wives and their children, and their struggles during British colonial rule. Some stories went back even further, to the time before, when the Luo were cattle herders like the Maasai, and not farmers like today. He was also told of the inheritance struggles that caused a family rift after his father's death, of the intergenerational anger between Onyango and Barack Sr., when the latter learned English and chose working for the colonials, instead of building his own hut and farming the ancestral lands. Onyango's family became divided, and many generations were still feeling the impact. It was during his last days in Nairobi that young Barack had a conversation that would stick with him forever. Asking his sister Oma for more information about the Luo people, she suggested visiting an old professor of hers, Dr. Rukia Odero. Rukia had been a friend of Barack Sr. and invited the siblings for dinner and conversation. It was Rukia who asked Barack if he was disappointed during his time in Kenya, noting that many Black Americans come to Kenya in search of an authentic experience of Africa, but what they find is far more complex. Everyone, it seems, wants to connect with their home culture, yet cultures refuse to freeze in time. British colonialism had left scars, yes, but some of them came from the Kenyan people's own defensiveness. Clinging to things like polygamy and collective land ownership that kept subsequent generations impoverished and divided. She told Barack that she didn't care so much about whether or not her daughter was authentically anything besides herself, that she should be free to be whoever she is, not conform to any tradition, Kenyan or otherwise. In these words, Barack heard his own challenge articulated, one he was willing to carry back with him as he returned to America and entered Harvard Law School. He would follow in his father's footsteps, while carving out a unique path for himself, a journey that would take him all the way to the Oval Office.